Kurt, thank you for joining us. You've been in London with a lot of other very well-connected and very smart people when it comes to international affairs, and Ukraine has been the topic of the week. And it's my understanding that you all have been discussing essentially um, how to put Ukraine back together, how to make it what it should be after this war and even during this war. What are your key takeaways?
Right. So the event here is called the Ukraine Recovery Conference. And has been an annual event for several years, first about reform and then starting last year about recovery. This is the first year where I feel like there's really some energy behind doing something now. I think people are beginning to realize that reconstruction and recovery of Ukraine is not something that comes as a consequence of victory. It's part of the pathway to victory. You have to actually have an economy. You have to pay salaries. You have to pay your military. You have to buy weapons. You have to have healthcare. So building that economy now is becoming more urgent. The second thing about this conference that has been very impressive, it was a deliberate focus from the UK government, is to get the private sector involved. That this should not be government handouts of American taxpayers or British taxpayers that are giving their money to Ukraine to rebuild. It's about creating the conditions where the private sector, private industry can say, we can see a pathway to making profits and building something new that will be beneficial to Ukraine and beneficial to us. And so we're willing to make the investment. And creating those conditions is a lot of what this conference discussion has been about. Things like war risk insurance, so that if your investment gets blown up, you're covered. Something that normal insurance doesn't cover, but maybe you can create programs through the World Bank or the EBRD that will cover that.
I'm sure one of the things that's been discussed is money, donations or loans, etc., helping Ukraine financially get back on its feet. And one of the things that I know that took place there this week is sort of a bit of an admonishment for Ukraine from Germany's Foreign Office addressing corruption.
Yeah.
How was that received?
Right. So that is very true. When we start talking about the private sector and investors in Ukraine, or even government aid, people have a memory of a legacy of corruption and ill use of funds and an economy dominated by oligarchs, lack of transparency. That's people's muscle reflex when it comes to Ukraine. So when they talk about helping Ukraine now, they want guarantees that we're not going back to that Ukraine. We're building something different. Now, there's several things that people are doing. First off, they're not just handing money over to Ukraine. As much as that seems to be what the headlines say, that's not the reality. They're actually putting money into programs that our own government controls, British government controls, the EU controls. Everyone is putting it into mechanisms where we feel like we have some assurance as to how things are actually done. In addition to that, what I would say is that there is a pressure on Ukraine, and pressure is maybe not even the right word. That's why I'm hesitating. There is a insistence to Ukraine that they must do more to protect the rule of law, to make sure that things are done fairly, that the courts operate the right way. These are things that people are telling them. And I think there's a different attitude in Ukraine right now. So, and I was there about 3 weeks ago. I went to Odessa, I went to Mykolaiv, I went to Kiev. And the attitude that I picked up from the population in Ukraine is they're tired of screwing around. They know what was wrong before, and they are not going to tolerate going back to that themselves either. They are going to make sure that not only do they win the war, but they firmly establish Ukraine as a democracy, a market economy, and ultimately a member of the EU and NATO. And they are super, super motivated now.
Well, that seems to be exactly what Ukraine needs, because it seems as though people are saying, yes, no, we're not perfect. And we acknowledge that we have faults and we've made mistakes that in part have contributed to some of our problems. But at the same time, everybody recognizes they didn't deserve to be invaded by Russia. They didn't deserve any of what Russia's done and how that's impacted Ukraine, the European neighborhood, and the whole world. So I'm curious to know, based on what you have heard and learned from your contacts, how's Russia swallowing this?
Well, Russia is in a very different position now from where they were a year ago. Their military is unable to launch military offensives on the ground. They're dug in for defense now, and they're starting to lose ground on defense. They are facing significant sanctions from the international community, including on financial transfers, including on oil and gas, which are impacting Russia's macro finances in a significant way. They have bans on things like semiconductors, which make it hard to get the replacement parts to build new things. So Russia is in a relatively weak position. They are trying to play a bravado hand. They're threatening nuclear weapons. They're moving them from Russia to Belarus. They're suggesting, that maybe they blew up that dam, and now maybe they'll blow up the power plant, Zaporizhia, and create all this radioactive cloud that will drift over Europe. So all of these things are ways that Russia's reacting. But I think from the Western point of view, what we have to do is say, what are the realities that Russia's facing? They're in a weaker position today, and their position will continue to get weaker over time. And we should be leaning in to help the Ukrainians end the war more quickly.
There has been some chatter over the last 16, close to 17 months about Vladimir Putin's longevity. But there's always this discussion about the devil you know and the one you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of what happens, I mean, Vladimir Putin is human. He won't live forever. How is Russia positioned to operate after Vladimir Putin?
Well, clearly there are risks. There's a risk that you get somebody in after Putin who is even more hardline nationalist, aggressive, militaristic than Putin is. So that's possible. There's also a risk that Russia falls apart. And then you've got chaos and loose nukes and a declining economy and migration in every which direction. That's also worrisome. But I think the most realistic scenario is what we've seen happen in the Soviet Union in the past. When they get rid of a strong leader, and remember when Brezhnev died, you go through a succession of relatively weak leaders. And the reason for that is you have other centers of power. You have the military, you have the intelligence services, you have the state-owned enterprises, you have these rich oligarchs, and they want to have someone in the center who is not a threat to them. So rather than the strong figure driving the country over the cliff, which is what's now happening, they would rather have somebody more controllable in the middle to protect their own interests. So that's the most likely scenario. No matter what, I think that we shouldn't be afraid of change because change happens all the time and we can't control the fact that Russia's going to do what Russia does. What we should be focused on is what our interests are and what's going to create a position of strength for the West, for our security, for our economies, no matter what happens in Russia.
Do you get the sense that there are some people that are afraid, some people in positions of power in the West that are afraid, that are risk averse, that don't want to do anything because they're still afraid of angering Russia and Vladimir Putin? They're still afraid of what Russia might do. They're concerned overly. Do you are you seeing that kind of activity and thought process from some of these Western leaders?
Yes, yes, you still see that, JJ. It's true. You see both Washington and Berlin, maybe some other capitals, they're afraid of provoking Putin. Maybe he'll do something that he hasn't yet done. Nuclear weapons always comes up in that context. They're afraid of escalation. They're afraid of getting into a situation where our own troops get involved. So there's a lot of things that cause people to hesitate. And the evidence of that is in things like the ATACMS, these long-range artillery shells that fly 300 kilometers and hit with precision. We're not providing those to Ukraine. We are not providing cluster munitions. It took us a year to get to a decision on F-16s. So all of these things are evidence of hesitation that we don't want to create that escalation with Russia. My own view on that is that if Putin could escalate, he would have done it already. He is in this war to win. He knows that his own legacy depends on it, and he's simply not able to escalate. And that's why we should be helping as much as we can now.
I hear what you're saying. about that caution, that overly cautious view of this, what Putin might do. And yep, I hear exactly what you're saying about if he could have done it, he would have done it. And so, listening to that and thinking about what we have at play here in the United States, we have our own dilemma here. Once again, a political dilemma. And again, I don't get into the politics here on this program, but when it fits into a conversation, you have to address it. You can't just leave it out there.
Yeah.
One of the key things that's coming up again in this country, just as it did in 2021, was that concern that what happened on January 6th, we might be running into that same pattern, thought process that might lead to that again. You know what I'm saying? There are people that still looking at some of the old political leaders, old political ways. What are your thoughts about how that plugs into continuing this support that the U.S. has given Ukraine? It could change.
Yeah. Well, look, I have a fundamental belief that America has national interests, and they don't depend upon Republicans or Democrats or, who won the election, what happened on January 6th, and who doesn't. I really believe we have some fundamental national interests. These are anchored on our identity as a country, our values, freedom, democracy, rule of law, and so forth. And they're anchored on strategy towards dealing with adversaries. We have to have strength, we have to have allies, we have to have goals and vision and protect a community in the world that's good for the United States. I don't think that breaks down on Republican Democrat lines or anything else. Now, certainly we have people in our political system at very high levels who will argue that, oh, no, this is wrong. We shouldn't do this. We shouldn't do that. But I don't believe that they represent either a majority of the political class or a majority of the popular spirit of the American people. I think the American people know that they know who we are as a country, as a democracy, and they know that we want to live in a world that respects the values that we have. So I think that we can keep this together and we can keep going. It will be, as with all politics, it's always a fight. There's always arguments. You have to make your case, but I think we can get there.
So a couple more quick things then. Yeah, so we can get there. We can do this. How then do you look at what it is that's taking place with people like Navalny, people like Kara-Murza?
Yeah.
Got American hostages like Paul Whelan, Gershkovitz. I mean, you've got another gentleman there now. You look at that mindset, that process, and think about what appears to be maybe a long-term process of taking hostages to use as leverage later. And so then you have this concern about leaders from other countries that support Ukraine that may not get elected again, that all might change. So is that too much worry, or do we just need to go day by day, step by step with this?
Well, I think actually it's good you bring up those examples because what do you do with any kidnapper or a terrorist or a hostage taker? You don't just pay them off, pay the ransom, because then they do it again. And that's exactly what we're seeing with Vladimir Putin. They take Brittany Griner, they make up some charges. Maybe she had done something. It doesn't really matter. The purpose was to take her as a hostage, create turmoil in our political system to get her released. And then eventually she's traded for some genuine criminals from Russia. And then they take more hostages and they do it again. So the only way that we should really react to this as a country is to confront the bully directly and not pay the ransom.
Okay. And the very last thing I'll ask you is, do you have a view on Ukraine today? What's happening on the ground today? You said you were there recently and you talked to people, you saw things yourself. Do you have a view on where things are going now with this counteroffensive?
I do. But before talking about, what's happening on the ground, the military operation, I think something has connected, something has flipped in the spirit of the Ukrainian people. So young people, I was doing the math today. If you were 20 years old in 1991 when Ukraine became independent again, you're 53 years old today. So that generation of young people, all the way up to maybe in their early 50s, they have come to a conclusion that, no more screwing around. We are going to fix this. We're going to defend our country. We're going to push the Russians out, and we're going to fix things. Because they know perfectly well what was happening with corruption in Ukraine, with bad governance, with people cheating on the margins, and their attitude is no more. We are gonna fix this now. We can't afford this again. So that's the attitude, and that is incredibly inspiring. Then on the ground, I've seen a few articles this week that say the counteroffensive is not going as well as intended. I have a different view. Maybe I'm a little bit optimistic here, but I didn't expect this counteroffensive at this stage to produce anything. I expected them to be testing. Where are the Russians? How do they respond? Can we get them to spread their forces? How do we test these waters so that when they make a big effort, they know how to do it? But in that process of probing and testing, they've managed to take over 100 square kilometers of territory. They've cleared pathways through some of these minefields. They've been able to take advantage of the situation in ways that I don't think anybody expected. So I'm actually pretty upbeat with what we've seen so far. This is an indicator that the Ukrainians are in control of their own actions. They're composed. They're acting methodically, and the Russians are not able to really stop the process here. This is encouraging to me.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you so much. Your view is always right on target and exactly what we need to help put some very complex and complicated things in perspective. Kurt Volker, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, JJ.